Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Bull Take Scouting Podcast. Slowly but surely, the NFL draft is coming along. It feels like we've been in this process for a while, and then it somehow still creeps up on you. And now we're in April, just a few weeks away from the draft. And so we're bringing to you our rankings for the biggest position in football, and that is the quarterback position. There's been so much frenzy at the top of the draft order with the Panthers trading up to one. We still don't really know who they're going to be taking, if it's going to be CJ Stroud or Bryce Young. And that's a really interesting discussion. And I think that's where our rankings start, Alex, is at the top. We both have Bryce Young. So let's get right into this. Why do you have Young over Stroud?
I think, to me, Young does everything a little bit better than Stroud, and he has less weaknesses. I think on the top end, right, Stroud might have a better arm, but to me, Bryce Young, just extremely smart. You see it on film, and you hear it even more from reports coming out of his interviews. Apparently, he crushes those. Tony Pauline reported that teams consider Bryce Young a genius, which, I mean, that cannot be understated for a quarterback. We heard the reports of him at Alabama, bringing ideas to Nick Saban and that Alabama coaching staff of what to do with the game plan. And that all shows up on film. He progresses through his reads really, really well. He's an elite processor, great football IQ, and he's a really good distributor of the football. So to me, those are the biggest things you really want from an NFL quarterback, and he really checks those boxes for me.
Yeah, I agree. And just to underline what you said earlier, Stroud really does all those things well too. It's just Young is kind of a notch above. And for me, what it comes down to is this might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think Stroud's accuracy is good, but it's not great. He's very often hitting throws right on the money, but there are some mechanical issues that lead to him missing and the ball placement being a little off sometimes. And you can't just look at the completion percentage when you're evaluating a quarterback's accuracy. You got to watch the tape, see how often he's making his wide receivers adjust, because very often once you get to the NFL, those issues are exasperated. And what was a completion in college is an incompletion in the NFL. And where I see Stroud as being maybe a safer pick than Young is because he's 5 inches taller, a couple dozen pounds heavier, so he might be more durable in the NFL. But that's a little bit overblown in my opinion. I think Young, just because he's small, doesn't mean it's just a guarantee that he's going to be injured. I mean, that hasn't been the case so far in his career, and that's kind of what some people seem to be implying. I don't think it makes sense to flop from Young to Stroud only because of size. I understand because the margin between the two isn't that big, but I'm just going to take the quarterback that's more accurate, because at the end of the day, the main job for a quarterback is to deliver the football to his wide receivers, and I think that Young does that even better than Stroud. But don't get me wrong, these two guys are up there. They're really up there, and I think both of them are going to be franchise quarterbacks for sure. As much as I'm pretty confident in having Young over Stroud, I really like CJ Stroud as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do want to touch on Stroud's accuracy a little more because I think we kind of see it the same way. We saw it the same way last year in regards to his accuracy. I think he might be the most accurate deep ball thrower in the draft. He throws a beautiful deep ball. He can drop it right into the breadbasket. But to me, there were not a lot, but there were a handful of intermediate and even shorter throws where I just saw, they came up as completions. They show up on the stat sheet on completions, but they were not accurate passes. We saw, not to compare him to Zach Wilson, but we saw Zach Wilson do this in both his first two seasons, where throwing the ball at guys, behind the line of scrimmage, 2 yards down the line of scrimmage, the guys would have to reach up well over their head to go catch that ball. I saw some of similar plays from CJ Stroud. Do I think he'll be a much better quarterback than Zach Wilson? 100%. I do think he's a franchise quarterback, but I just think it's those small things. I agree it's some mechanical things. Maybe the footwork isn't perfect all the time, is maybe a little bit inconsistent, that just knocks him a bit below Young for me. Both really good quarterbacks. Young's size does concern me a little bit. I might be a little bit more concerned about that than you. But I agree. It's not something that you can drop him below Stroud for. He's the better quarterback to me on tape. He's more consistent, just all around, in my opinion. The best quarterback probably the past 2 years for me. So I just think Young above Stroud, the size a little bit concerning, but other than that, for me, really no true weaknesses for Young.
Yeah, and both these guys are so advanced. When I specifically look at the feel in the pocket that these two guys have, it is really rare to find draft prospects at the quarterback position that can sense pressure the way they do, can maneuver in the pocket around it, and exhibit the poise that they do. They are already professionals in that area, and that is really one of the biggest traits when evaluating a quarterback prospect. And now we look at the where they're likely to land. And first of all, the Panthers, I alluded to, we don't really know at one what their move is. Do you have an early inclination, though?
So I thought I knew. I think everyone kind of thought they knew about a week ago. It kind of seemed like they were leaning Stroud. Everyone was kind of saying, yeah, Stroud's their guy. And then some things have kind of started to leak out about, a lot of people in the Panthers organization really like Bryce Young. There was the train of thought that Frank Reich doesn't want a quarterback below 6'2" or shorter than 6'2". I heard a report that before Reich took the Panthers job, he had told someone, I'm not sure who it was, but someone obviously close to him, that he really liked Bryce Young as a quarterback prospect. Does that just mean he liked his tape? Would he be willing to take him as his franchise quarterback with all the quarterbacks available to him at the first overall pick? Not really sure exactly what that means, but it does make it a little more interesting. So honestly, right now, I'm not really sure. I'm leaning Stroud, but I wouldn't be shocked to see either one.
Yeah, I agree. I still think it might be CJ Stroud. At this point, I'm not reading too much into he told him that he really likes him, be that Frank Reich or Josh McCown or really anyone in that organization, because I do think they really like both these quarterbacks. My gut still says that CJ Stroud's going to be the pick. I think that's who they moved up for, and I think that's just who it's going to be. But I can't really say that there's much substance to the reasoning behind that, because it probably is a near toss up for them. And I'm just talking about that situation. I'm I think that it's kind of what you usually get if you're going first overall. You're not going to be in the ideal situation, but with both these guys, I think they're really rare prospects that can transcend a bad situation, and that might be kind of what the whoever doesn't go to the Panthers might get into if the Houston Texans at number 2 indeed pull the trigger on a quarterback, because there you're kind of seeing an offense that's relatively low on talent compared to the rest of the league, but with how refined these guys are, with how they've been reputed to be both really intelligent, really hard workers, I think that they're going to be able to overcome that. But on the topic of the Texans, there's been a lot of recent buzz, especially led by Lance Zierlein, who is a well-respected reporter who's often is up there in terms of his accuracy on mock drafts compared to the rest of the media. He had a pretty bonkers mock draft, which really the madness started at to where after Young went 1, the Texans passed on CJ Stroud and then traded up from 12 to 7 to draft Will Levis instead. And he stated that it's really not a lock for Stroud to go number 2. Are you buying that?
Totally. I think he ends up going to. I don't think it's a lock, just because I think from things and conversations that I've heard, it seems like the Texans don't feel like they have to take a quarterback. Nick Caserio knows he's kind of in it for the long haul, and I don't think he wants to force that pick. What is interesting that I heard another conversation about from Chris Sims, who was with the Patriots scouting department for 2 years after he retired as a player. He brought up the fact that when he was there, Bryce Young wouldn't have checked off any of their boxes for a quarterback due to his height and his weight. And Nick Caserio was there. He said he was kind of the lead scout. Obviously, Belichick was the general manager, but Caserio was kind of under him at the time. So that is kind of an interesting thought, especially if Stroud goes young. If Stroud goes 1, will the Texans be comfortable with Young's size? A lot can change in 10 years in the scouting department. I think 10 years ago, a lot of people would have written off Bryce Young, but it is an interesting conversation to have. I think they end up taking whichever quarterback is left over between Young and Stroud, just because I think they're both franchise quarterbacks. But definitely an interesting thing to think about.
I agree. But at the end of the day, I think that when you've got a quarterback at that level, you can't pass on him. Sometimes there's some real value to the philosophy of building up a roster and then dropping in a young rookie quarterback when you're really ready to contend, and that gives you a 5-year window when he's playing on a rookie contract, and you get to pay all these other veterans to try to go get a Super Bowl. And we've seen teams like the Bills specifically use that model. The Bengals didn't really employ that model, but we're seeing the benefits of having that star quarterback on a rookie contract there too. I
The
just
Chiefs
think
did.
that yeah, that is true. But I think that you're sitting there, you're looking at one of these two guys, which is just such a good quarterback prospect. You've got to pull the trigger. I think now we can move on to maybe the most interesting prospect in the NFL draft, and that is the absolute unicorn that is Anthony Richardson. He is just an unbelievable physical specimen. He's just really the biggest, strongest, fastest quarterback that we've seen come out in a long time, but he's flawed because he's really inexperienced. He's only started for 1 year. And although he can really wow you with those physical traits, with his cannon of an arm, with his outstanding athletic ability, which isn't just, like a Lamar Jackson type athletic ability. He's also got, and I'm not saying he's quite on that level because he's so much bigger, but he does have that, Josh Allen type size where it's not only speed that you're worried about, he could also run over your defender. But the problem is that he plays in a really simplistic offense that was really keyed down to his level of inexperience, with a very, very few plays being set out for him. And he's not consistently accurate. He doesn't read the field consistently. So there's a lot of projection. And what I think is interesting about Richardson is I think everyone agrees on everything I just said. Yet there is such a wide range of opinions on where he should get drafted. That's what I think is really fascinating about him.
Yes, it's really shocking because I think everyone sees the tape the same. Everyone knows he's extremely inconsistent. Everyone knows he's super inexperienced. His completion percentage, I know we say we shouldn't look at the stats, but it was below 60%, which in the college level is not very good. But he has all the physical tools you could ever ask for a quarterback: the arm strength, the rushing ability, his size. You mentioned it all. And to me, it really comes down to how much do you trust your coaching staff to develop him?
Mm-hmm.
Because he's not a guy that you want to miss out on.
Yeah.
If you need a quarterback, you pass him up, and 2 years later, he's an elite quarterback because of his traits. You could end up getting fired, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you take him and you don't develop him, you would also end up getting fired. So it's a really tough situation for any general manager and head coach that's in need of a quarterback. So to me, it comes down to having to trust your coaching staff. If you look at Anthony Richardson and look at your coaching staff and they say, "Yep, we think we can develop him," you take him. You have to. But if they say he's not worth the risk, maybe he's a 40% chance he pans out, probably going to pass on Anthony Richardson. So to me, it comes down to a truly team-by-team basis. Are we willing to have him ride the bench all of year one, learn, develop him, and then maybe go through a rough patch in year 2 before maybe in year 3 he can be fully unleashed?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And when I look at the draft order beyond the top 2 picks, assuming that Young and Stroud are the only quarterbacks that have a chance at landing in those 2 spots, Richardson has some potential really good landing spots. I see at 4 the Indianapolis Colts. That's a really well-built, sound organization with Shane Steichen as the new head coach, who he brought along and developed Jalen Hurts fantastically. And this is kind of a similar prospect. And you're looking at 5, you've got the Seattle Seahawks. Pete Carroll's a great offensive mind. He just made Geno Smith into one of the top 10, 15 quarterbacks in the NFL. At 6, you've got the Detroit Lions, who Ben Johnson is going to be an extremely hot commodity on the head coaching trail next season. And he turned down, reportedly, the Panthers head coaching job to stay in Detroit. So having a year for one of the youngest, most bright offensive minds to develop Richardson would be huge. And then at 7, you've got the Las Vegas Raiders, which is a pretty good situation too, because you can sit behind Jimmy Garoppolo for maybe a full year even. And then when you're playing, you've got Devontae Adams, you've got Josh Jacobs. There's some real weapons to elevate you. So I think that although I don't have a top 10 grade on Anthony Richardson because the tape is just way too far from that and it's too much of a projection, he's really dependent on where he lands, but I like the landing spots that are the most likely right now if we're thinking of him potentially as going in that 4 to 7 range.
Yeah, I think the Colts landing spot to me makes a lot of sense, just because of Shane Steichen and what he did with Jalen Hurts. The Lions, I'm a little bit concerned about that, just because I don't think Ben Johnson's going to be there after this year.
Yeah,
like you mentioned, he's a hot commodity in the head coaching or possible head coaching department. I would be worried as Brad Holmes, the Lions GM, if we say, all right, we'll take him, we'll let him sit behind Goff for a year and develop. I would want to know that I have Ben Johnson for at least 2 to 3 years to help Anthony Richardson along. So I'd be concerned. We have another really good year. Ben Johnson leaves. Now I don't know what I'm going to do, because as much as I love Dan Campbell, I don't think he's a quarterback whisperer like Ben Johnson.
We know that.
The Seahawks, I think that's a really good spot for him. The Raiders as well. An interesting spot that I think he could end up going, depending on, what happens between now and the draft. The Baltimore Ravens. I think we have no clue what's going on with Lamar right now. Would there be a team like, the Colts, that would be willing to trade away the 4th pick for Lamar, because Lamar's a proven commodity? The Ravens did this before with a underdeveloped passer with a really good rushing threat in Lamar Jackson. I think John Harbaugh's going to be there a long time. So I just think it's an interesting fit for him, where I think would be a really good spot for him to succeed if the Ravens end up moving away from Lamar.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And at the end of the day, I would put my money on him being the 4th pick of the draft. Probably the Colts, but, watch out. And as you said, maybe the Colts are willing to swing that 4th pick for Lamar Jackson, who's a lot more proven than Richardson, even if he does carry those injury concerns. And Baltimore knows that they've developed a quarterback and that has a similar profile and goes with Richardson. I think that's really interesting. And now I want to get into where our quarterback rankings really differ from other people. That's where universally, or almost universally, we're kind of seeing Will Levis as the 4th quarterback, and he's probably going to be the 4th quarterback off the board, maybe in the top 10, but in my opinion, probably in, the 16 to 25 range, something like that is where I would project Will Levis going right now. A team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, or maybe the Detroit Lions with their 2nd pick, or maybe the Minnesota Vikings, I think, would potentially take him at 23rd. But that's not who we have as number 4. We've got Hendon Hooker. And Hendon Hooker, to me, is just a better quarterback right now. And that's what you're drafting him to do, is play quarterback. Will Levis has a really good traits in that he's really big. He's got a really strong arm, and he's athletic. But I just don't see a refined quarterback prospect at all. And contrary to Richardson, you have to understand the context here. Richardson is really inexperienced. He's only started 1 year. Levis has been through multiple programs and has multiple years of starting experience, and he hasn't figured it out yet. And I know that the coaching will get better in the NFL, but there's some aspects of his game that I think are a little independent of coaching. I find him incapable of sensing pressure way too often, and that's a killer in the NFL for young quarterbacks. And routinely, I don't see him anticipate. I see a player get to the spot where the ball should already be there, but Levis is waiting for him to get there, and then he delivers it. And I have a tough time seeing those things changing. Meanwhile, Hendon Hooker, who I have above him, and so do you, is a really accurate quarterback prospect who's also got good traits. He's got good size, good arm strength, and good athleticism. He's a real running threat. And where I think he should improve, and why I probably don't have a first-round grade on him, is I think he has some issues sensing pressure too. But I think if he wasn't 25 years old, and especially if he didn't tear his ACL towards the end of the season, we'd be talking about him as a surefire first round pick. And to me, he really is a better quarterback than Levis.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. We both have him above Levis. I think he's starting to rise up boards, and sounds like
Oh,
it's
yeah.
he's got a shot to go in the first round.
Yep.
But I really agree with everything you said about him. He's a more refined quarterback. He doesn't necessarily have the upside that Will Levis has because Levis has all the traits that you mentioned. But I'm not confident that Levis will reach that upside.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll probably get into Levis a little bit more in a couple minutes. But to me, like you said, Hooker, I think he's really smart. He shows some anticipation. Um, One concern I think for me and other people as well is the system he's coming from.
That is
We
true.
haven't really seen quarterbacks succeed in that system. He's routinely in the shotgun. I don't see him do a lot of drop back passing. It's shotgun, 1-2, throw the ball. And to me, really, my biggest concern, or not my biggest concern, but one of my biggest concerns is I don't really see him move around the pocket that much.
Mhm.
He's a
Yeah,
fairly
that's true.
athletic guy. Um, but there are a lot of times where I see the pocket closing in on him, and either he doesn't sense it or he doesn't feel comfortable enough to step up in the pocket or roll out. And I just see him just kind of stand there, almost as if he had like cement bricks on his feet and just throw the ball. Does the ball come out accurately? Yes. I mean, he finds the open man. The ball comes out accurately. He throws a good ball. He can lead receivers open, but it's just a little bit of a concern of seeing him just stand there and let the pressure come to him. That just gives me a little bit of a cause of a concern.
Yeah.
Could that
I,
be coaching? Could that be system? Yes, I think improve that as he gets to the NFL. But just one of the things that I kind of noticed on tape, and I was like, that's a little bit interesting.
yeah, I agree with that analysis. And so what is it that puts Hooker above Levis? Is it pretty much kind of what I was saying about Levis?
Yes, yeah, I think now we can get into Levis a little bit. I just think he's super inconsistent, and right
Mm-hmm.
now he's all traits. I mean, you
Yeah.
see the effortless arm strength. He can flick the ball with his wrist 50 yards down the field. We all see that on tape. But to me, his mechanics can fall apart when he's rushed. He looks. I think you mentioned this super jittery in the pocket when there's pass rush either in front of him or coming around off the edge. Um, and I feel like his play got worse from 21 to 22.
Well,
I
that
know,
I do understand because he dealt with so many injuries in 2022. He lost multiple guys like Wandale Robinson and got a new offensive coordinator that really didn't tailor to his skill set and had a really shaky offensive line. So like that one, I kind of give him a pass for.
yeah, I mean, I agree. The injuries definitely, play into it a little bit. I guess the offensive coordinator makes sense too, but I'd rather not see him take a step back. Even
Mhm.
if he could stay on par with his play in 2021, that would make me feel maybe a little bit more comfortable. But I wasn't even a big fan of his play in
Yeah,
2021.
I agree with
I
that.
needed to see him take a step in
Yeah.
order for me to feel comfortable with him as a prospect. So I'm not really putting all the blame on him because of that, because like you mentioned, there was a lot of extraneous circumstances for his play, but I needed to see him take a step forward for me to feel comfortable um, in his NFL future as a starting quarterback.
That yeah, that's where I agree with you is that if the 2021 tape had been first round quality, then I would have been more likely to give him a pass to the extent of projecting him as a franchise quarterback and giving him a first round grade. But to me, that already wasn't the case. And just one last thing on Levis is that I really am bothered by the fact that he was beat out multiple years in a row by Sean Clifford and had to transfer out of Penn State because he couldn't win that starting job because of the traits that he has and the play of Sean Clifford that really held back a talented Penn State team for a couple of years. That's really surprising to me. And I think it's time to move on to a guy that I have, as you can see on these rankings, sandwiched between Hooker and Levis. You have him right after Levis, but my fifth quarterback isn't even Will Levis. It actually is Dorian Thompson Robinson from UCLA. And when I turned on the tape, I just didn't understand why this is a quarterback projected in the late rounds. This is, for starters, a quarterback with good traits. He has good height. He has a strong arm, and he's athletic. He's really athletic. I mean, this guy can kill you with his legs. He is like a one cut dashing running back where he's immediately upfield and he's losing that first defender before they even really have a chance. They're just grabbing for air. So he's super sudden to get upfield as a runner, and he's a good passer too. He's accurate. He goes through his progressions well. I think the main issue is it's kind of weird because usually when a quarterback doesn't see the field well or sees the field well in one regard, that applies to kind of all aspects of playing quarterback. But whereas I think he progresses through his reads well, for some reason he is kind of prone to throwing a few too many interceptions because he doesn't see a lurking defender, or it takes a tick too long to release and the defender gets to jump the route. But I think that's really the one big thing to clean up. And my other concern with him is that has a really thin frame, and he's missed a couple games or been taken out of a couple games nearly every year that he's been at UCLA. So I think that I'm afraid that you could see a similar rate of injury as, say, Lamar Jackson. But that's really all that even keeps him behind Hendon Hooker for me. Is I think if he was stouter, I would have him even above Hooker. That's how high I am on DTR, because I think he's a guy with good traits. He's a dual threat quarterback, and he's really accurate. So I love DTR. I would take him in the second round. I think he probably goes third, fourth round. We've heard him heavily connected to the Minnesota Vikings. I love that idea for them. Just take a good starter in round one. In round three, draft Dorian Thompson-Robinson. You've got a year or two, however many years to develop him behind Kirk Cousins, and he could potentially be your next franchise quarterback. That's an idea that I'm in love with for the Vikings.
Yeah, I think that pick would make a lot of sense for the Vikings. I don't think I'm as high on DTR as you are. The thin frame is really what holds me up a little bit because he's a dual threat quarterback. I'd say he's almost a better rusher than he is as a passer, which, that's okay. He's not a bad passer by any means. But when the biggest impact of his game is as a rushing threat, and he weighed in at the combine at, I think, 202 pounds, which is smaller than Bryce Young, by the way. His playing weight is not going to be 202 pounds. It's going to be less than that. And he's going to be getting hit by linebackers, defensive linemen that are 250, 300, 315 pounds.
Yeah.
And that is what concerns me, honestly, quite a bit. If his game wasn't as dependent on the run, then I would feel a little bit more comfortable. That's why I'm a lot more comfortable with Bryce Young, because he is not a rushing threat quarterback. He is a ball distributor, a very, very good passer. And the other thing that kind of holds me up on DTR a little bit is the deep ball. It doesn't seem like he has great arm strength to push the ball down the field. Yeah. I think he can put good velocity on the ball, 10, 15, 20 yards down the field. He can hit guys in stride very accurately. But once it gets over 25, 30, 35 yards, I see, a little bit inconsistent accuracy, and at times he's making wide receivers stop and come back to the ball. And in today's NFL, I think you kind of want a quarterback that can push the ball down the field a little bit more than he can.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think sometimes people get a little too far out of themselves with the deep ball because it still is a really small percentage of the throws you're going to be making in the NFL. And I think the throws that you make in the NFL, he does really well in the short and intermediate range. But, overall, this is a guy that, it seemed like was like a 6th, 7th rounder. Now we're hearing 3rd, 4th rounder, and I think that's closer to the range where he belongs in. But I'm glad he is getting more hype. And to me, I think there's really – so I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4 tiers globally here for the quarterbacks. Young and Stroud are on their own tier. Richardson is in his own tier. And then Hooker, DTR, and Levis are in a tier where they definitely can be a starting quarterback, but I have some reservations that keep them away from a first-round grade. And then after that, it's a few guys that I think could be backups, but I really have to squint hard for them to be NFL starters. And there's definitely some potential. Aiden O'Connell is a tall, accurate passer, but there's some mechanical issues and just some areas to develop, and he's not really a running threat. So there's really a lot of there's thin margin for error and a good amount of work to be done. So it's kind of hard to project him. I think Jaron Hall definitely has some traits. He's a dual threat quarterback, but again, there's a lot of things to work on, and he plays in a really simplistic offense at BYU that we saw Zach Wilson really struggle to transition out of. And then The last two quarterbacks that I scouted, Tanner McKee, I think is kind of similar to O'Connell, where he's not a running threat, and there are really way too many issues for me to take him on day two as a passer, particularly just starting with his really long windup, which really bothers me. And then Max Duggan's a guy that I want to root for. I know you do too, but there were already some issues on his tape, and I didn't have not liked his pre-draft process at all. He really struggled at the Senior Bowl and like really had a poor pro day workout, which is pretty rare because it's scripted to a quarterback strength. So that bothered me. But before we get off there, do you want to say anything about a couple of these guys? I know you just scouted O'Connell and Duggan, but do you see any potential for either to be an NFL starter?
Not really.
Yeah.
I agree with what you said about O'Connell. He's got some good arm strength, good size. But really, other than that, I see him as kind of a reliable backup guy.
Mm-hmm.
Duggan, I think I wanted to call him a reliable backup as well, but I'm kind of thinking of him as almost a borderline backup now.
Yeah, QB3 type.
Yeah, we see that, he played really well in the playoffs and throughout the season. But to me, it doesn't really translate to the NFL. Maybe if he is drafted as a backup and sits for a couple of years, fixes some things, I think he could end up being a reliable backup just because it seems like he does have that it factor where if he's, thrown in a game, he could, maybe make something happen. And that is something that you kind of look for in a backup. So I think he does have some redeeming qualities there if, he can take a couple of years to kind of sit behind some guys and learn. But, I think there's really 6 guys that have the potential to be good starters in the NFL with 2 guys at the top or 3 guys at the top that I think have superstar potential in Young, Stroud, and Richardson.
Absolutely. I mean, overall, this is a really good quarterback prospects or class. I'm sorry. I see 2 surefire franchise quarterback. I see Richardson with, almost like a 50-50 shot at being a superstar. And then Hooker, Thompson Robinson, and Levis, I'd be surprised if no franchise quarterback comes out of that group. So we're potentially looking at, 3, 4, maybe if we get lucky, even 5 franchise quarterbacks. And that's a whole lot out of a class. So I'm really excited to see where these guys get drafted. I think a lot is going to depend on their situations, and it's going to be really interesting to analyze those and, just seeing them develop and seeing, how these rankings turn out, because at the end of the day, we're scouts. We want to be right. There's some bold moves being taken here with Hooker above Levis, DTR above Levis in my case, and we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Definitely a good year to be in need of a quarterback because you also have options, So it'll be fun to see how these guys pan out the next few years, see where they land less than 4 weeks from now. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon.